podcast comes to you with thanks to our friends at Trafalgar Square Finance, leading independent specialists in mortgages and all types of property finance. Whether it's buy-to-let, development or bridging finance, Trafalgar Square can help you organise your funding for your next property project. Exclusively to listeners of Your Property Podcast, Trafalgar Square offer a free one-to-one consultation. So whether you are a portfolio landlord looking to raise funds on your existing portfolio, or if you're just starting out and want to find out if you are eligible for a buy-to-let mortgage, Trafalgar Square Finance can help. It's easy to book with one of their experienced consultants by simply visiting yourpropertynetwork.co.uk/finance. You can find this link in the show notes for more details. Hello and welcome to Your Property Podcast. My name is Michelle Kearns and today we've got with us Christian Ribeiro. Hi, Chris.
Hi there, Michelle. You okay?
Great, thank you. It's great to have you on. And I saw you speak a couple of months ago now at a local networking meeting over in Manchester. And I found your story really inspiring and quite unique, really, in what how you've kind of come to be in the property world. It's not one that is very common, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So I'll let you explain, and I don't want to kind of steal the thunder, but how did you get into property then?
Oh, I appreciate that. Well, that's my first ever talk I've done as well. So that was just a one-off. So I hope I do a few next year. But yeah, I did waffle on a little bit. So I do apologise for that. You'll have to do it all again with me now. But so basically I'm a retired footballer now. So I came through at Bristol City's academy, from the age of 9 to 22, I was there, and then played for numerous years after that. But I was forced to retire at the age of 27. So I did my ACL and cartilage in my knee at my debut at 18 when I was at Bristol. And I played for 10 more years in the Football League, but my knee was deteriorating basically over those years. I was constantly on painkillers. I was wearing away my cartilage until finally I had no cartilage left in my knee and I was forced to retire. And my last club was at Oxford United in League One. So I still did okay. I played close to a couple hundred games in the Football League and a couple of times for Wales, but I never really sort of achieved my goals in football playing with that. And that's quite a normal story in the footballing world. I think I was looking at some stats the other day, and I think the average length of career in the footballing world is 8 years. So I managed to beat that. So it is a short-lived one, but yeah, I was retired officially by 27. And it just so happened, we'll go into my story a little bit of why property is such, but in that time, I wasn't earning crazy monies in the Football League like some of the guys in the Premier League and top of Championship were, but I was plugging bits away into property, mainly on the premise that, your family would say, oh, having a property is a good idea. It's a solid idea for your pension plan. And that's just how it started, which is what I imagine a lot of people have the same mentality, is just, well, if you've got a little bit of money that you've done well enough to save, well, just park it somewhere and do it that way. That's kind of the very, basic vanilla starting way to do it. And that's what I did while I was playing. And I quietly, as I knew my knee was deteriorating so quickly, I realized I wasn't going to play till I was in my early 30s. And it could be that in the late 20s I had to retire. So I started to look into property as an avenue because I did enjoy it. I did enjoy studying it and it made me a few pounds before. So that's how I got into it. And I quietly then became known in my little changing room in the footballing world a little bit as a bit of the go-to guy for just basic property knowledge at that point. And that's when I retired at 27. It was, that's what I thought, well, I want to do something for my players, something around property. And I thought, well, can I create a service where I do all the work for them and build their pension pots in property? Because nobody did it for me. And I went through that scenario of retiring young, and to lose your job, lose that opportunity of decent income from footballers because you have to start at the bottom of the ladder all over again. I had a long-term partner at the time that broke up. So I went through all of that sort of the typical sort of transition, I guess, into the real world that footballers go through. And I thought, well, I can help people like me. And that's how it started, from just a small group, and it just quietly grew from there.
Wow. So it must have been quite a shock to the system, really, because obviously, entering kind of the football world, completely different world to the property. So you're going into the football world and you've got high hopes of kind of continuing as long as you can. And how old were you when you kind of knew about your knee, that you were going to, your career in the football world was going to be limited?
Yeah, well, I did my knee on my debut at 18. I was out for a year after that. And I remember when I came back, even at that age, 18, 19, that I wasn't the same player even then, because I was all about athleticism really. And as soon as I did money, I wasn't the same. I wasn't as agile. I couldn't twist because my cartilage, I'd lost a chunk of that. And so even then, at that young age, I knew, oh, well, I'm not going to be the player I could have been. But then it came to the sort of the early 20s when I realized how much pain I was playing in. I was just surviving day by day, really, to get through training. I tore pretty much every muscle, but I was loads of injuries in my career. So I had plenty of time in the early 20s. I guess it's a blessing and a curse to think about what I do after football, really. As I do feel sorry for the guys who just have a one-off incident in their mid-20s. They might break a leg in a tackle, so they're not prepared for it. They were flying high and suddenly it's gone. And I always bring up the topic, so I think people forget that for professional sportsmen, you spend all your life being an expert in your field. Whether you play Premiership or League Two, you're still in a tiny minority that get to the top level. But when you stop, that's it. You can't ever use that skill set again. In most other jobs, if you lose your job, well, you just move to another business doing something similar. Whereas in professional sport, that is it. You apart from, you could argue, coaching, but coaching is another new skill set, and it has nowhere near the earnings capabilities or security that football or professional sport can have. So you really do start from scratch again elsewhere, and that's quite a daunting prospect when you're in your mid-20s or early 30s. You literally have to start a new life again. And
it sounds like you were forced to do it. I guess some people might say the more sensible route of of building up the property income on the side whilst you were kind of exiting your career.
Sure. And I think property, the reason I think property is so good for footballers is you don't need to rely on the income whilst you're playing football. That's if we all had that luxury, that'd be perfect for property, where you don't rely on the income. Let that build, keep reinvesting until there is a time where you want some of that equity or some of that cash flow. I think that's an amazing position to be in. I think that's when property works at its best, really, is when you have something else bringing in good amounts of money, whether that be a job or a business or whatever, that you can then just keep plugging it away into assets over time in solid areas, knowing you're playing the long game. But property is a long game, really. I think it's really hard to make property in the short term. It's really, really hands-on and difficult. But that's why I think property works so well for players, that they can plug monies away when they're in their early 20s, mid-20s, and have 5, 10, maybe 15, if they're really lucky, years of compounding and growth. And by the time they retire, they can have a really sizable portfolio, or a really lowly geared portfolio, by just being smart and even just doing just the basics. They can be in a really good position, but you have to make those decisions early. And when you're playing footy, it's really hard to do it on your own as well. Because I know from doing it myself, and why my friends never bought properties or did one in 10 years or whatever. It's because you don't have the time or inclination. So you do need a helping hand with it as well.
Yeah. So you've kind of learned it from scratch yourself, how to build a portfolio. So did you just go with single lets, or did you kind of experiment and do commercial or anything there?
Yeah, well, just from the basic, it was just single lets, because I think single lets are just sort of the bedrock of most people's portfolio. There's so many reasons I'm big on them, but the basics of, there's loads of stock for them, there's loads of demand, there's loads of finance availability for them. We're in an island, we've got a shortage of homes, so there's a lot of typical things you always hear is really strong for single lets. And it just then depends what your goals are. And first, using our client's example as footballers, well, they're trying to build pots of equity over the next 5, 10, 15 years for their retirement, and some steady cash flow in it, whilst also being as passive as possible, because all their time is trying to be the best player they can be and have the best career they can be. Because the honest truth is, they'll make the most money in football than they will in property, realistically. If they can go up a league, get a better contract, they'll make more money in football. They're better off being as good as possible in their day job. But then every time they do get lucky enough to have 40, 50, 100 grand, 200 grand, £1 million, whatever it may be, that they plug it away in assets. And I think the single let model for the players sort of fits them perfectly. I'm not saying they can't do other stuff, but just their experience, the time they can put in, whatever, I think that works really well for them. And that's what I did. Simple single let stuff. When I started, I was in Bristol, and it was really, really basic. I was 19. I was fortunate enough to buy my first apartment. And I looked at Bristol. This was 2008, 2009. So the market was sort of at a bit of a low at that point. And it was a really basic idea of, well, I'm in the middle of a really great city. I'm sure if I buy this is just a pension pot. In 15 years when I retire, hopefully I'll have a bit of income from it and a bit of capital growth. and it served me pretty well. And I did that again, and I bought some others later on. But I did dabble later in some small HMO stuff, and that was my first learning into it. If you're not going to do it properly, or if you think it's easy, it quickly falls down. And that was a good lesson for me, where I bought some small stuff through other people I won't mention, and it didn't go so well after sort of 6 months. So I turned it back into single lets because they were only small, like 3-4 bed houses, and so that's always been the bedrock for me, has been single lets, and that's what we've done for our players. Now we just have scaled that into larger and larger refurbs or more volume in apartment buildings or portfolios. But yeah, we're definitely pro on the single lets model.
Yeah, it certainly ticks a lot of the boxes that, as you said there, if they're not looking for the cash flow right now, they don't need the high kind of cash flow from service accommodation or HMOs, and they can park the money, and then it's long-term cash flow and long-term assets. That makes a lot of sense, and provides a very simple business model for you, I guess.
Yeah, well, that's it. I think it depends what everyone's goals are, but for footballers as a specific client, it's their time really. It's just impossible for them to learn how to develop or source or manage something like a HMO. That's really difficult. It's really difficult for someone doing it full time now in this market and demand. So it's just not feasible really for players to do that. And I don't think they even want to as such. It's almost that they see property as just a vehicle for them to create some long-term wealth and also hopefully some income where it can pay for their mortgage. If they can have a few buy-to-lets that brings them in a few quid, that they can have their mortgage covered every month, or their car, on a lease or whatever it may be. And that sort of the single let strategy gives that to them over time as passively as possible. And also it's the exits as well, isn't it? That's why I really like single lets, where at the end, if somebody like the stuff we do, they might buy 1 a year, 2 a year for 10 years. Well, they could sell 1 a year if they really want, or if they don't want. That's quite an easy exit, as when you have some of these investment style properties, you're only selling to investors, and that's a whole new world when you're selling into that market. And
True.
For someone who's a very passive investor, that's they're not interested in that, to be perfectly honest. They're just more, they see the houses, sounds a bit callous myself, but as boxes with numbers on it. It's just like a bank account that's high returning for them, and they just want to, every time they get that pot of money, plug it away, focus on the football, and hopefully by the time they're in their late 20s, early 30s, late 30s, they can have something to sit back on.
Well, how do you see things have changed? Because obviously you've been doing this for quite a long time with one strategy. So how does working with single lets now, has that changed much since you first started?
Yeah, well, we've been going about 4 or 5 years now, and I think we've done just over 60 projects, and some of these newer ones are multiple units in a block, but I've only counted those as one. So we've sort of scaled up into larger and larger things. But when we started, we're based in South Manchester, so all our properties are Greater Manchester area. So that's a really hot market, really competitive. So that's the reason we're focused up here. There's a lot of fundamentals where I think Manchester's a great place to be. But yeah, when we started it, there definitely was less competition than there is today. And we've seen that change over the last few years. And I think we've gone through a period where to find something where I consider there being a decent discount or ability to add value, we've had to go for particularly heavy refurbishments on simple stock, because that's where there was 80% of people didn't want to have to deal with a full back to brick refurb, or a sort of 20, 30, 40 grand refurb. A lot of people go, whoa, I won't do that. But someone would go and do a property that just needs carpets or whatever. So you found that, I guess, sort of in our area, we're talking sort of under 180 grand, 100 to 180 grand single let type stock has been so in demand for the last few years that it's been really hard to make things work, what I consider make things work, be worthwhile enough. So we've had to take on a lot of refurbs. So all our projects really have been heavy refurbs. We buy quickly with cash a lot of the time, whether that's players' funds, our funds, private funds. We do lots of refurbishments and then we remortgage out and pull some monies back. And that's a model that we often do. And then sometimes we get some stuff where we do have a letting agency as well. So we buy stuff that are tenanted, that could be, tenants are on lower rents than they should be, or an owner's distant. So sometimes we pick up some stock that's just discounted for a number of reasons. But you've always got to try and find an angle really why there's a bit of a discount, or there's a way to reconfigure, add value, refurbishments. But you've definitely in the last couple of years almost had to refurb things to create value, because everything's been so expensive. And I think we're probably going to move into more of a world, well, I'm seeing it already, where you can offer at a discount and potentially get it. And it's just then, can you get it at the right return for what you're looking for? So everyone's got a different margin, haven't they? If you were expecting to buy something spend 30 grand and pull all your money out on a single let. Well, those days are probably gone, or you're going to get one every couple of years in that sort of property. So that's very much about expectations. But if, as an example for players, they're looking for something where they can plug their money away, yes, they might get a few hundred quid in a cash flow, but they're already earning good money. That's not that's not the real reason they're buying that property. They're buying it because they're hoping that over the next 10 years, they're going to have some good exposure to capital gains. And I think over the last 20 years, I think the average in the country is something like 5.5% growth. And the average in Manchester is something like 6.5%, 6. So, and that's included great financial crash. We've had all the things we've had in the last 20 years. So if you could have 5-6% growth with using some leverage and mortgages, you can have a really good return over the longer term. But that depends on everyone's mindset of what they consider is good in your timescales. But players have the longer term mindset, so they're quite happy to go into something quite passive, hopefully get a nice discount on the way in, which is what we help with, and be in an area with great fundamentals, like somewhere like we are, Manchester and South Manchester. And they just want to accumulate over time. And they're fortunate enough where they earn in another job enough to buy 1, 2, 3, 4 year, but they need someone to help them do that. And all the difficulties of, being a landlord, buying stuff, manage it, maintaining it. That's where we come into it, really.
Right. And you said there about expectations, and typically when I speak to sources, they are working directly with investors who have got very high expectations of what they consider a deal is. I did interview someone a few weeks ago, and Shiv, and he deals with sort of more passive investors that aren't looking for the kind of crazy deals. It's just kind of like this parking money. But how does it work with footballers who they don't necessarily understand what is possible through creative ways of adding value? Do you set the kind of return and say, this is really like realistic, or do you find that actually they want like quite a good return for them?
Yeah, well, I guess it's all everyone. I have had different conversations with them, but generally, to be honest, over the last few years, we've always done refurbishment projects to try and increase returns, and we've had some that have done phenomenally well, and some that have had a little uplift but nothing to shout about. It might be some have had 40, 50, 60 grand uplifts from the work. From it's often things that you bought sort of pre-COVID or during COVID. Suddenly you had an increase from doing a nice refurbishment, but also the market went up another 5-10% in a year. So suddenly we had probably a year or so of projects that did phenomenally well and had extra tens of thousands of equity on them. But then other ones that have just been from spending 20, 30, they added 20 or so, which is great. But they just from the players' side, to be honest, they are very easygoing, where even 20 grand doesn't make a huge difference to their life. They're not looking for that money today. This is all building up their pot for when they're 32, 34, 36. So yes, we have players. There is certain returns that we have that we try to hit, whether that's an equity gain or cash on cash return as such. But they're also buying into the idea of being in the right area, the fundamentals of why they're in it for a long term. Because I see property as a long-term game. And yes, with the projects we do, we're trying to squeeze some percentages to get the best out today. But I don't think there's any getting away from that. Property, the time does the heavy lifting in property. Trying to make money in 6 months, it's difficult, isn't it? It is difficult. Yeah. It can be done, but it's really hard. And the idea of, no, I'm buying to sit on it for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, then it opens you up to, okay, well, I want to be in a really good area. I want to have good schools nearby, good employment in that area, good regeneration, etc., etc. So hence why I moved all the way up the country and parked myself in Manchester and built a business up here. And that's worked so well so far.
Yeah, most people are looking to get out the day job, aren't they? But I guess that's not the case.
Yeah, well, and that is the challenge, isn't it? Because if you're trying to replace, as an example, £2,000-3,000 as fast as possible, then single lets in this model isn't the quickest way to do it. It won't be. But that depends what you're trying to do, isn't it? And like anything, if you want a higher return in the short term, you normally have to put in more legwork or take on more risk as a general concept. So. That's over to you. But our clients as players, they don't want either of those things, really. They want relatively low risk or low to medium, but then they don't want to put any time in whatsoever. I mean, our guys don't lift a finger. They basically sign some documents and that's it. They'll never see the properties. The very few have ever wanted to see them. They're not interested. It's just for them. It's like, as I mentioned earlier, it's like another bank account that they know is handled elsewhere. And because property needs to be handled by someone, all the time to make sure it performs optimally all the time, and that it's there for when they're retiring. That's how they see it. So that's what we built our model for, and our service is to be as handheld as possible. So our players have everything covered, from the legals, from creating a company at the start, to sourcing a property, taking them through that. When we buy it, we have all the build teams, because we're always on 5 to 8 sites at a time. Sometimes we're on more than that. And we manage all the refurbishment. And then we've also got a letting agency, which is, it's not mine, it's my business partners. It's a bit like a sister company that manages them. So it's kind of everything that could be as handheld as possible. So as I mentioned, the players just sign documents, pay some invoices, and their portfolio, we can grow it all from there.
Well, it sounds like you're adding a lot of value there for them. They're getting a pretty good deal for the whole service. And I guess I'm thinking, well, go into the effort of doing that full refurbishment to be able to pull money out and possibly recycle a lot of it. Seems like a really good deal for them. Do you have to educate them so that they can see the value that that you're providing?
Yeah.
I'm thinking in my head, well, why don't you just go about and buy one that's sort of off the shelf? It's not as as much return, but if that's not their priority, then why kind of make it complicated?
Yeah, well, I think what we've almost done it the hard way, to be honest, Michelle. We've done it really hard, but that's because, one, I'm really proud of what we've done, and we genuinely care, because these guys are my community. They're my friends or friends of friends. So I've always wanted to do as best as possible for them. But I think in the next year, we'll probably bring out, because there's only so many people you can help with that model as well, because there's only so many projects you can do, especially at that scale. I mean, as I mentioned, we've done like 60 odd now in the last couple of years, and several of those now are like blocks of 3, 4, one of 14, stuff like that. So there's only so much you can handle at one time, with a small team. There's only me, Jay, Claire RPA, and there's some more people hopefully that are joining the new year. So I think to try and help more people, we will start bringing on more of a product saying, look, if you want to buy to let that's maybe discounted, but it's pretty straightforward, we might touch it up a little bit, but it's not going to be back to brick refurbs all the time. We can start to help people that way, but we haven't really done that so far. But I think we're going to start bringing that in next year to help more friends in that side. And then we'll continue doing the other bits as well for players. And we also have our side that we do for ourselves of the heavy refurbs and flips and whatnot. So there'll be a few arms to the business there. And I think that's where we want to take it. But you almost have to work. I think, like with anything, you have to earn your stripes a little bit. Yeah,
that's true. Yeah.
It takes, it's taken us 4 years to get to the stage of doing this sort of volume. But now in this area, I'd like to think we're quite well known with the agents or with contractors or whatever. And sometimes you have to earn your stripes, sort of take over your area a little bit, and then you can start to branch off into other things.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you're doing so many refurbishments at the same time. What systems have you got in place to manage that? And how do you work with so many different contractors, or is it one contract that goes between projects?
Yeah, well, that's been a big learning curve. In fact, that's been our biggest problem, especially in the last year or so, where I'm sure for everyone, it's probably been the hardest time ever, hasn't it, to get good contractors, get things delivered on time within budget, or just to make things stack enough because of the cost of refurbishments and whatnot. So I do give ourselves a little bit of slack, I guess, for that, but it has been really tough. We found in sort of the mid to late 2021, we had a massive influx of projects come in, and we started then doing sort of 12, 14 at a time, which was a big step up for us when we were doing 5 at a time, 6 at a time. Suddenly we started doing 10, 12, 14, and they were all relatively big refurbs. We're talking, 30, 40 grand jobs on single lets as an example. So we struggled where we've got about 4 or 5 build teams that can do, and they're varying of size. Some do 1 at a time, some do 2 or 3 at a time, some can do 5 or 6 at a time. But at one point, we only had 2 or 3 build teams, and 2 of them were more 1 or 2 at a time. The other one was sort of picking up everything else. But you quickly find that they couldn't pick up everything else. They were good on sort of 3 to 5, but when you give them 8 or 10, things are going to slow down and you're going to have problems. And we definitely struggled with that at large parts in the last sort of 18 months. And that was a big learning curve for us. We grew too quickly, and we've had to then reach out. I think during last year, it has calmed in the second half last year. We found a couple of other really good build teams who have the capability of doing numerous jobs. And now we're growing that. So now we've got more like 5 or 6 build teams that can handle 3 or 4 each, as an example. And over time, as you scale up, you need different types of builders, don't you? It's like anyone, if you're doing one at a time, there are guys that will do it relatively cheap, and I have 4 or 5 lads, and they'll do a buy-to-let house in a good time. But then when you need them to do 3 at a time, they can't do it, and you do pay for that. But then it's just, you have to have stringent procedures to find the right ones, and then you just test them on one. And I guess the beauty of our business is, we know from doing all these refurbs, we've got all this design sheet, all the specs, so everything's pretty set up for them. And then we'll test them on one. Once they've passed our sort of stringent test, we'll give them one, and we'll closely monitor. If they do that well, right, there's one waiting for you when you finish. And that's been good in our model, that they want to work with us because we always pay on time. We've always got month funds there, but we are stringent. We check it every week what we're paying for, and then they learn to work with us. We learn to work with them, and then you sort of weed out the ones that you don't want to work with. They're not professional. Then you find the good ones, but it's not an exact science. You do just have to work through it. It's a huge challenge in the property world that your business can be reliant on contractors. It really is, isn't it? So
it really
it's
is,
just one thing. It's a constant side of the business you're working on. It's never perfect. That's never perfect. It's just you're always monitoring it, always having to work through problems and find solutions. But that's normal for all property.
That's what we get paid for, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And how do you what kind of stands out for you when working with the contractors now? Obviously, you've kind of had a couple of years, but they've been pretty intense where you've been working with lots of different contractors. So for people starting out, what advice would you give them to how to pick a good contractor?
Well, the first thing is just communication is so key. So everything comes down to communication in so many sides of business, but especially contractors, because no one can read each other's mind, and what you may think is obvious of how they're going to do something, they're doing something completely different. And often I think people underestimate how many things are going through a contractor's mind at one time. They've got so many things they're sorting on just one job, and they likely have numerous other jobs they're quoting for, snagging, finishing out, and all the rest of it. So communication's a big thing. So it's all about preparation of exactly what you want. And it could be down to the things like where's a plug socket's going to go in a room. Literally write it on the wall and say it, so there's no ambiguity about it. And we've learned the hard way on that, where I come to snagging and the door's opening the wrong way or something, or the light switch is on the wrong side. And you think, just such basics. Over time, you have to make those mistakes sometimes to learn. If only I'd have just put a post-it note on the side and said, please put it there. It would have been fine. Now it's going to cost X amount to sort it, or a delay of X amount of time to do it. But I think you just got to be as prepared as possible. And then as for finding contractors, I mean, it's the usual things about recommendations and whatnot, but we're lucky. We've been lucky that because we had the letting agency from the start, we already had a gang of contractors who were doing work in the letting, so we knew who was reliable, who was good, who was expensive, who was cheap, etc. And from there you sort of cherry pick them, and over time, through meeting other people, through doing something, you do just see people who are working nearby, you go and speak to them, and quietly you drip feed them in. But I do a feel for lots of people who started in the last 18 months, because it must have been hell getting new contractors in, waiting 6 months, a year, because people have had pipelines that are big. But I think that's changing now. And I think as the demand subsides, I've noticed that contractors are looking for more work, and some are calling back asking, is that project still coming? So I think it's going to get easier for that. But then we have other challenges to deal with, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. Just all cycles.
Yeah,
and we're recording this in December 2022, and you've mentioned there about it's easing up on the contractor side. There's a bit more capacity for them. How about materials? Are you seeing change in the prices?
I think not so much. For me personally, the stuff we're doing, I haven't seen anything that said, oh, things are getting cheaper really, or that much easier. It's been pretty constant all year, where it's just been really expensive to do most things pretty much. I think maybe easing a little bit, but I don't know exactly in the short, I consider the short, the next 6 months. I'd like to think that the sort of demand will drop off a bit, where there isn't so many home improvements going on all the time, so people's labour costs might trickle down a little bit as there's more competition for work, which hasn't been there at all, has it, over the last couple of years? So there might be a bit of a reduction, but there's still a lot of things going on in the world where I'm not necessarily sure that the supply of materials is going to dramatically increase, therefore reducing costs. I don't have the information to tell you that. I'm hoping that it does dampen a little bit, but I think it's got a little bit more time to play out, that one.
Yeah, I think so too. And what about on the other end? So when you're valuing the properties, what's your feeling about that end GDV, you know, what's going to be worth at the end with
Yeah.
the market as it is
Well,
now.
the good, I guess, one of the good things in our business is because you're doing a decent amount of volume, I'm constantly getting updates of what a surveyor's valuing something at, what's gone well, what's not. And so I'm normally quite glued into what's happening in the market. And what I'm seeing at the minute was the last 2 years, I've been able to pretty much stretch an extra 10 grand on a property, whatever, and it would come in and just out of nothing, I'll just create an extra 5-10 grand for just asking for it. As I think now it'll just get tighter and tighter. Ironically, the way surveyors value properties is on the data of what's sold. So it's normally 6 months behind, which is the hottest part of the market we've had. So bizarrely, whilst everyone is getting more negative on the future values, maybe we are going to see a slump, the data they're working off is from the highest they've ever had. So you might find that elongates a little bit further, where a 2-bed terrace in your area might have been selling for 160, well, they were selling for 170 a year ago, but you might think they'll be 150 in 6 months' time. The surveyor is going to go off the data, but I think you just have to be like what I do at the minute. I think if you're budgeting, be cautious at the minute, because if we do see a lot, because demand is dropping from interest rates, I think you're already seeing a sort of 5 to 10% reduction in what people are just willing to pay. So while people talk about this price drop as a big scared thing, when you speak to agents, it's almost already happened, because in our area in Manchester, if you had 150 grand 2-bed terrace as an example, they'd put that up and say to the owner, they'll probably go for 155, 160, accept that, you'll be happy. Now they'll put the same property on for the same price, but if 145 comes in, they say you should take that at a decent offer. So that sort of 5 to 10% is already happening. It's not dramatically changing anything, but I think it's already going on. You're just not seeing all the data yet. But in the next 3 to 6 months, you'll start to see it, and you'll start to see that dampening happen. And I know it'll vary in price bandings as well, but talking about the buy-to-let stock, which is sub 200k stock, I'm talking Manchester now, that you're just going to start to see that sort of drip feed down over the next 3 to 6 months. But it's still, honestly, there's still really good demand. You speak to all agents, they're still really busy, things are still going. So I guess it's area related as well.
True. And how do you find working with private finance? Because I think one thing you mentioned when I saw you speak was about, I think it was a couple of months ago now, so when the mortgage rates just shot up really quickly. So what's your feeling on, mortgage interest rates versus private finance?
Yeah, well, from the private finance, we've been very fortunate, and it's been a bit of our detriment, I guess, is that we built a business over the last 4 years pretty much on our phones, because we had great contacts from the football side and contacts from family, friends, business owners, colleagues that had large funds. So we've always raised private finance with no problem. I think we've raised 4 to 5 million quid over the last few years over a number of projects that were, could be 100 grand at a time. Yeah. Our biggest one was about 1 million quid odd. And we managed to do that in, I think it was like 9 days, we raised 1 million quid. So we've been fortunate by having good contacts. And because we've done a lot of projects, we've always paid people back. They've always made that, we've always been super secure. People trust us. And as an example, in that 1 million quid one, I think the largest lender in that was something like 700 grand. But he'd already lent to us for sort of 10 different other projects that were circa 100 to 200k each one. I'd always had his money back. So for him, it was, oh no, that's fine. I've got the funds there. It's the same type of project, just on scale. I'm happy to lend it. And he's actually got paid back this week, the most interest we've ever paid back. So I think there's lots of money out there. And I think there's always great opportunities to raise private funds. The reason I think property is so powerful for that is because they can lend against the asset. So if you're buying relatively well, it's not even on you. As if you're raising money on a business, that's a risky investment, because they're relying on you to keep that business going. In property, they're just going to take the asset. So they're very secure. They can have a first charge, a personal guarantee, etc. That's an amazing way to be able to scale up your business and raise funds. That's a huge plus in property. I think private funds is massive in the sort of projects we're talking about, where we're buying stuff that's unmortgageable or needs heavy refurbishment or needs to be purchased quick or has a legal issue, all these reasons why they may be need to be purchased outside of a mortgage. Private finance, we always use private rather than bridging, to be honest, because we're fortunate enough to do that. But bridging's the same concept. It's just it's a little bit more difficult to dealing with a bank again, and you have to jump through more hoops as such. But they're absolutely tools you need to use if you want to grow a portfolio quicker and add value. If you want mortgages, fine, standard stuff. But the challenge most people have now is with stress testing, although that is calming. We did see for a period, stress testing was at 8%. That was incredible. So pretty much for 6 weeks, nothing transacted, because you just couldn't get a mortgage on anything. And I think now you are seeing that calm into sort of the mid fives again, so things will move. But I think logically, you just got to think if interest rates are up, everyone's cash flow is going to get hurt from it. There's no getting away from that. So you have to understand that like I keep coming back to, property is a long-term game. I think you make more money. I can prove it in capital gains than you will in your rent roll ever, for sure. But you've just got to be able to make sure that you're in the right price banding to be able to, one, raise a mortgage properly or get rents up, because what we're seeing in Manchester is rents have just gone absolutely crazy and likely will continue to as more people leave the sector and mortgage rates go. It means a lot of landlords will need to raise their rents just to break even is a lot of the time. So I've never been in the business like this where there's so many spinning plates at the same, there's so many changes, isn't there, all at the same time. It's been an absolute crazy year or two, but within that, there's some really good opportunities as well.
There is, yeah, absolutely. And you've got to place your strengths and play the cards you dealt with as well. So if you've got the opportunity to work with private finance, why wouldn't you? It's, generally speaking, it is more straightforward than going through, banks or
absolutely
lending finance. So, and do you find that if the interest rates are looking like they're around 5 or 6%, actually would their footballers leave the cash in and not bother getting a mortgage because, well, if they refinance at 5%, they've got to find something else to put it in like straight away?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, there is an interesting conversation. It's very a recent conversation in sort of the last couple of months that's the option. Because I guess now it's like you mentioned, it's like, well, you can get 5-6% by being your own bank,
Yeah, exactly.
Like, well, why would you give it to someone else? So I guess it comes down then to what pot of money do you have? Do you need some of those funds back to buy your next property? That's totally individual. But yeah, I mean, I've had different scenarios where some players are happy to just leave monies and now their loan to value on properties we bought for them 3-4 years ago, their loan to value is probably at 50% now, 40% on something where they had it discounted back then and now it's done so well. But they're very relaxed. They don't see necessarily that remortgaging is part of their plan. Their idea is, well, if that can be at 30% loan to value by the time I retire, I'll refinance then, thank you very much. And I'll have 50 grand, 100 grand, 200 grand that I can put in, and live off for a period of time or pay something else off or sell, whatever it may be. So it's very much down to, what you're looking for, what's possible. So, I mean, the players, everyone's a bit different. That ranges from the Premiership guys we've got to Championship and League One. Everyone's a little bit different. But if you have the luxury of having good income everywhere else, then why wouldn't you just leave your money in it? But, I just think the investors, the private investors as well, I find they're starting to raise their rates quite rightly, where we normally raise money at sort of 8 to 10%. But I've had some people say, no, I want 11 now, I want 12, or I want from 8, I want 10, as an example. So it's just happening across the board, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, an interesting world to be in anyway. Very kind of clearly defined, the single lets and invest and the footballers, just, it seems very kind of clean. It's not like all mixed up with all different strategies and different types of investors. At least you know what you're working with. So and so I'm not sure how many footballers we've got who listen to this podcast.
I don't know.
But if anyone wants to obviously follow what you're doing, because I know you're really good on social media and posting all your what's going on with your refurbs as well and keeping up to date, because obviously you've got your fingers in lots of pies and your finger on the pulse of what is going on with doing so many projects at once. So where can people find out more about what you're up to?
I appreciate it. Well, I don't think I'm so good on social media. I need to make more effort on that. But I only really use Instagram. So they can follow me on there. I think it's at Chris M. Ribeiro _. So I just document our stuff there. But in the new year, we're going to start pushing that a little bit more and maybe get a videographer to come around and do some projects. It's only me that's ever done it. And we should do a lot more. And now we're working on these apartment blocks and portfolio purchases and larger scale projects, which we come back to the basics. They're just single lets on steroids because there's multiple of them in one building. It's just that they're in the one place. So as we talked earlier, it's almost like scaling up the simple stuff. It's taken us 4 or 5 years to get to that point where we have 3 or 4 blocks all on the go at the same time. So I've tried to give a little bit of the insight into the single let for players side, which is just regular stuff, then refurbishments, and then now doing some larger stuff. And coming back to, I think, why I think property is such a good strategy really for players. So if they want to follow along, that'd be great. And yeah, in the next new year, hopefully I'll be able to bring out some new stuff that'll be a bit more interactive and interesting. Fingers crossed.
Brilliant. Well, we'll look out for that, and wish you all the best for the next journey and see what happens next. Thanks, guys, and see you soon.